There are two types of betrayal, the kind you suspect is coming, and the kind that appears out of nowhere and shatters your reality in seconds. I discovered the second kind in my therapist's office, on what should have been just another Tuesday afternoon session. Shit. Sorry. Just give me 1 second to... Dr. Marlowe's voice trailed off as she scrambled to collect the papers that had scattered across her office floor when her folder slipped from her hands. I leaned down to help, gathering several sheets that had slid toward my feet. The movement was automatic, a reflex, until my eyes caught my husband's name on one of the pages. Robert Wilson. My hand froze midair. Robert Wilson, my Robert Wilson. The same Robert who had left our house at 5:30 that morning for another business trip to Phoenix. "I've got it, don't worry," Dr. Marlowe said quickly, but it was too late. My eyes had already locked onto the page, scanning the handwritten notes with a surreal detachment. Session with Diane Wilson, concerns about husband Robert's frequent absences, claims business trips to Boston, suspicious phone calls, found receipts for jewelry she never received. Boston, not Phoenix. And who the hell was Diane Wilson? The room tilted violently around me. A high-pitched ringing filled my ears as blood rushed from my face so rapidly I thought I might faint. The page trembled in my hand. Allison, I need you to breathe. Can you hear me? You need to breathe. Dr. Marlowe's voice seemed to come from miles away. My lungs burned. I had forgotten how to inhale, how to make my diaphragm expand. When the oxygen finally rushed back in, it brought with it a wave of nausea so powerful I doubled over. "I'm so sorry," Dr. Marlowe was saying, her professional composure cracking. "Those notes weren't... I should have been more careful with my files." I finally found my voice, though I didn't recognize the hollow sound that emerged. "Who is Diane Wilson?" The silence that followed told me everything before Dr. Marlowe even spoke. "I can't discuss another patient with you, Allison, you know that." "Another patient named Wilson?" My voice rose sharply. "Married to a man named Robert who travels frequently for business?" Dr. Marlowe carefully took the paper from my still trembling hand. "Allison, this is a terrible situation. One I've never encountered in 20 years of practice, but confidentiality means..." "Confidentiality?" I laughed, a brittle breaking sound. My husband has another wife, and you've been counseling us both?" Dr. Marlowe set the papers aside and leaned forward, her face etched with genuine concern. "I didn't know, Allison. I never made the connection. Robert Wilson is a common name, and neither of you ever mentioned the other's city in our sessions." "Neighboring cities. Robert's business trips, always 3 or 4 days, sometimes a week. Always returning with stories about clients and hotels and restaurants I would never see, never visit, stories I never questioned." "How long?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "How long has she been your patient?" Dr. Marlowe hesitated, then sighed. 8 months, about 2 months less than you." 8 months. The timeline aligned perfectly with when Robert's trips had increased in frequency, when our intimacy had begun to fade, when I'd started therapy because I thought my insecurities were damaging our marriage. "I think I'm going to be sick," I whispered. The revelation wasn't just that my husband was cheating, not just that he had systematically constructed a second life, but that he had a wife. Another woman who sat in this very chair, pouring out her heart about the same man, wrestling with the same fears that had brought me here. A woman who, like me, thought she was the only Mrs. Wilson. "What do I do now?" I asked, not really expecting an answer. Not sure any answer could possibly make sense in a world suddenly turned incomprehensible. Dr. Marlowe's expression was grim. "That depends on what you want, but first you need to understand what you're dealing with. This isn't a simple affair, Allison. This is something far more calculated." I clutched my purse against my chest like a shield. The wedding ring on my left hand caught the light. The diamond Robert had said belonged to his grandmother. I wondered now if Diane Wilson wore its twin. "I need to find her," I said suddenly, the words surprising even me. "I need to talk to the other wife." Robert and I met at a charity auction 5 years ago. I was coordinating the event. He was a guest who bid generously on several items. When he approached me afterward, complimenting my organizational skills rather than my appearance, I was instantly charmed. "Most people don't notice the logistics," he'd said. "They only see when something goes wrong. You made everything flow seamlessly." He asked for my number with a confidence that wasn't arrogance. He called exactly when he said he would. He remembered small details from our conversations. He was thoughtful, attentive, patient. Everything I'd given up hoping for after years of disappointing relationships. "I travel a lot for work," he'd warned on our third date. "Investment consulting takes me all over the country. It's not always conducive to relationships." I'd assured him we could make it work. After all, my event planning business kept me busy too. The space might even be healthy. How perfectly he had set the stage from the very beginning. Our courtship had been a whirlwind. Engaged after 6 months, married 6 months after that. We bought a house in Lakewood, an upscale suburb of Denver. Close enough to the city for my business, but with the yard Robert insisted we'd need for the kids someday. Kids that 3 years into our marriage hadn't materialized. Not for lack of trying initially, but the past year, Robert had been traveling more. Our romantic life had dwindled from passionate to perfunctory to practically non-existent. "It's just work stress," he'd explain after another mechanical encounter. "This new client in Phoenix is demanding." Phoenix, not Boston, never Boston. Robert's work as an investment consultant had always been somewhat vague. He had business cards, a website, client testimonials. I'd met colleagues at our wedding and occasional dinner parties. Everything seemed legitimate. "I handle private portfolios," he'd explain when I asked for details. "Mostly high net worth individuals who value discretion. I can't really discuss the specifics." I'd accepted this explanation, impressed by his professionalism and respect for his client's privacy. Now I wondered if those colleagues had been actors, if the website was a shell, if everything had been carefully constructed to support his elaborate deception. In therapy, I'd been working through what Dr. Marlowe called self-abandonment, my tendency to silence my own needs and instincts to preserve harmony. I'd come to her because I'd begun experiencing anxiety attacks, convinced I was failing as a wife because I couldn't keep Robert interested, couldn't give him children, couldn't stop him from pulling away. "You seem to take responsibility for your husband's emotional state," Dr. Marlowe had observed in our second session. "Why is his happiness your job but your happiness isn't his?" The question had unsettled me, as had her gentle probing about why I didn't question Robert's frequent absences. "Are you afraid of what you might find if you look too closely?" she'd asked. I'd been indignant. "I trust my husband," I'd insisted. "That's what marriage is about." The memory of those words made me physically ill now as I drove home from the therapy session, clutching the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Trust, such a small word for such a devastating loss. When I reached our house, the home I'd lovingly decorated, where I'd planted perennials, expecting to watch them bloom for years to come, I sat in the driveway, unable to make myself go inside. Everything looked exactly the same as when I'd left for my appointment 2 hours earlier. The carefully maintained lawn, the navy blue shutters I'd insisted would give the house character, the welcome mat that read "The Wilsons" in cheerful script. The Wilsons. Apparently there were more of us than I'd realized. I finally forced myself through the front door, moving on autopilot to the kitchen where I poured a glass of wine with shaking hands. Robert wouldn't be home for 3 more days. 3 days in Boston with his other wife. 3 days for me to decide what to do next. I took my wine to Robert's home office, a room I rarely entered out of respect for his privacy. Another boundary he'd established early. "I handle sensitive financial information. It's better if my workspace remains secure." The locked file cabinet mocked me from the corner. The password-protected computer sat dark and silent on the desk. For 5 years, I'd respected these barriers without question. Not anymore. I set down my wine glass and began systematically going through every drawer, every shelf, every book and box in the room. Most contained exactly what you'd expect: office supplies, reference materials, cords and adapters, nothing incriminating. The bottom desk drawer, however, held something unexpected. A second phone, powered off and tucked beneath some old tax returns. My hands trembled as I pressed the power button, watching the screen illuminate with a generic background image. No password protection. The contacts list was short, just a dozen names, none familiar except one, D.W. Home, Diane Wilson. The text messages told a story that made my stomach clench. Exchanges about dinner plans, complaints about a leaky faucet in our house, a discussion about Thanksgiving plans with your parents. A separate life, complete and fully realized, running parallel to our own. I scrolled further back, looking for clues about how long this had been happening. The texts went back 14 months, likely when he got this second phone. But how long had Diane Wilson been in the picture? Had he married us both around the same time? Was our entire relationship a carefully orchestrated fraud? The most recent message, sent just that morning, drove the air from my lungs. Landed safely in Boston. Can't wait to see you tonight. Been thinking about you all day. While I'd been driving to therapy, believing my husband was in Phoenix, he'd been texting his other wife from Boston. I set the phone down and moved to the file cabinet. The lock was simple, a basic key lock. I'd never tried to open it before, respecting Robert's need for client confidentiality. Now I took a paper clip from the desk, straightened it, and attempted to pick the lock based on a YouTube video I'd watched once out of curiosity. To my surprise, it worked after just a few attempts. Perhaps the universe was finally cutting me a break. Inside, I found neatly labeled folders, tax documents, investment statements, home maintenance records, all exactly what you'd expect. But at the back of the bottom drawer was a folder labeled simply B Property. Boston. With trembling fingers, I opened it to find property tax statements for a house in Brookline, a suburb of Boston, mortgage documents with both Robert's and Diane's names, home insurance policies, utility bills. They owned a house together, a house that mirrored our own in value and style based on the documents before me. How was this financially possible? Even with Robert's supposedly successful consulting business, maintaining two upper-middle-class households in expensive suburbs seemed beyond reach. Unless... I moved back to the computer, staring at the password prompt. I'd never needed to access Robert's work computer before. What would he use as a password? I tried the obvious, his birthday, our anniversary, his mother's maiden name. Nothing worked. Then I had another thought. I tried Diane's name plus what I assumed might be their anniversary, based on when the texts had started. The desktop appeared. A cold, calculated fury replaced my shock as I opened his financial software and began digging through the records. What I found confirmed my growing suspicion. Robert Wilson wasn't just a liar and a bigamist, he was a thief. The client accounts he managed showed systematic withdrawals, small enough to potentially go unnoticed, but substantial in aggregate. He'd been siphoning money for years, using it to fund his double life. I was married to a con man, and I wasn't his only victim. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with questions and half-formed plans. By morning, I'd made a decision. Before confronting Robert, I needed more information. I needed to understand the full scope of his deception. More importantly, I needed to find Diane Wilson. Finding her proved surprisingly easy. With the address from the property records and her full name, a simple social media search yielded results within minutes. Diane Wilson, 35, event coordinator at a Boston hotel. Her profile was mostly private, but her profile picture showed a pretty woman with auburn hair and a warm smile. The resemblance between us was subtle but unmistakable. Similar builds, similar coloring, similar style. Robert apparently had a type. I booked a flight to Boston for the following day, not yet sure what I would do when I arrived, but knowing I couldn't sit passively in Denver waiting for my lying husband to return from his trip. I needed to see this other life he'd built with my own eyes. Before leaving, I did something I'd never imagined doing. I copied all the incriminating financial records I'd found, along with photographs of the second phone and its messages. I uploaded everything to a secure cloud account and sent copies to my personal email. Whatever happened next, I needed evidence. The flight to Boston gave me time to think, to process the maelstrom of emotions flooding through me. Rage, humiliation, heartbreak. But beneath those immediate reactions was something deeper and more disturbing, a profound disorientation, as if the ground beneath me had vanished. If my marriage wasn't real, what else in my life was a lie? I checked into a hotel downtown, not wanting to get too close to Robert and Diane's Brookline home until I had a plan. From my room, I called in sick to the 2 events I'd been scheduled to coordinate that weekend, something I'd never done before. Then I ordered room service and opened my laptop, determined to learn everything I could about the woman who was also married to my husband. Diane's digital footprint was limited but revealing. LinkedIn showed she'd been with the same hotel for 7 years, rising from administrative assistant to event coordinator, a career path that mirrored my own. Her few public Facebook photos showed her at professional events, with friends, occasionally with Robert at her side, his arm around her waist, both smiling for the camera. The same expression he wore in the photos on our mantelpiece at home. I found their wedding announcement in an online Boston newspaper archive, dated 4.5 years ago, 6 months before he married me. The familiar nausea returned. I wasn't even his first wife. I was the second Mrs. Wilson, the sequel, the remake. Had he already been married when we met at that charity auction? Had he been wearing his wedding ring when he asked for my number, only to remove it before our first date? The thought made me retch, barely making it to the bathroom before emptying the contents of my stomach. After, I sat on the cold tile floor, trying to steady my breathing, trying to find some solid ground in this nightmare. I needed to see her, not just her online presence, but the actual woman. I needed to make this surreal situation concrete. The next morning, I took a lift to the hotel where Diane worked. I wore sunglasses and a hat, feeling like a character in a bad spy movie as I entered the opulent lobby and found a seat with a view of the reception desk. I ordered coffee and waited, scanning each passing employee for the auburn hair I'd seen in her photos. After an hour, I saw her. She emerged from a side door marked staff only, dressed in a tailored suit, carrying a clipboard, looking harried but professional as she greeted what appeared to be a corporate client. They spoke briefly before she led them toward the ballrooms. Seeing her in person was a shock, not because she was beautiful, though she was in an understated way, but because she was so utterly normal. Not a villain or a homewrecker, but a working professional, likely as deceived as I had been. I followed at a distance, watching as she showed the clients around a large event space, pointing out features, making notes on her clipboard. Her wedding ring caught the light as she gestured, a solitaire diamond almost identical to mine. The same grandmother's ring, I'd bet. I waited until the clients left before approaching her. My heart hammered against my ribs, my mouth bone dry despite the coffee I'd been sipping. "Excuse me," I said, removing my sunglasses. "Are you Diane Wilson?" She turned with a professional smile that faltered slightly as she took me in. A flash of confusion crossed her features, quickly replaced by polite inquiry. "Yes, I am. Can I help you with something?" She didn't recognize me. Of course not. Why would she? Robert would have been careful never to keep photos of me where she might see them. "My name is Allison Wilson," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'm married to Robert Wilson, your husband." The clipboard slipped from her fingers, clattering to the marble floor. All color drained from her face as she stared at me, uncomprehending. "What?" The word was barely audible. "What did you say?" "I think we need to talk," I said gently, surprising myself with the calm I didn't feel. "About the man we're both married to." "This can't be happening," Diane whispered, her hands shaking around the coffee mug. "This can't be real." We sat in a quiet corner of a cafe 2 blocks from her hotel, far enough away that her colleagues wouldn't witness her breakdown. She'd called her manager, claiming a family emergency, then walked with me in stunned silence until we found somewhere private to talk. "I have proof," I said, opening my laptop and turning it toward her. "Property records for both homes, the second phone, financial records." She stared at the screen, tears welling in her eyes. 4.5 years, she said, her voice hollow. "We've been married 4.5 years. 5 years for me," I replied, "but he married you first." She looked up sharply. "You didn't know when you married him?" Of course not. Did you think I knowingly married an already married man? I don't know what to think anymore, she said, wiping her eyes with a napkin. Everything I thought I knew seems to be a lie. I softened, recognizing my own shock and disbelief mirrored in her face. I didn't know until yesterday. My therapist accidentally showed me notes from your session. That's how I found out about you. Diane stared at me. Your therapist, Dr. Marlowe? I nodded. But that's my therapist. I've been seeing her for 8 months. I've been seeing her for 10. The implication sank in. He recommended her to both of us, Diane said slowly. Made the initial appointments, said she specialized in relationship counseling. A chill ran through me. He wanted us in therapy with the same person. Why? What could he possibly gain from that? Diane's expression hardened. Control, information. If we were both talking to the same therapist about our marriage problems, he could gauge how suspicious we were, how much we were questioning things. The calculated manipulation was staggering. Robert hadn't just created parallel lives, he'd created a system for monitoring both wives' emotional states, for staying one step ahead of discovery. When is he supposed to return from his trip? I asked. Sunday evening, he's on a business trip to Phoenix. Phoenix? I laughed bitterly. He told me he was in Boston, with you. Diane's face paled further. Then where is he actually? A third city? A third wife? The possibilities were too disturbing to contemplate. We need to confront him together, I said decisively. No warning, no chance to prepare more lies. When he returns to wherever he's really coming back to, we need to be there, both of us. Diane nodded slowly. My house, Sunday night. He always comes directly home from the airport when he returns from trips. Does he? I asked bitterly. Because he always stops at our house in Denver first, no matter where his flight lands. She winced. Of course he does. We spent the next hour comparing notes, aligning timelines, filling in the gaps in each other's knowledge of our shared husband. The pattern was clear. When Robert was with me, he was supposedly traveling to Phoenix, Houston, or Chicago for work. When he was with Diane, Denver was his purported destination. His actual whereabouts for the current trip remained a mystery. A call to the airline confirmed he hadn't taken his scheduled flight to Boston, nor was there any reservation to Phoenix under his name. He's embezzling from his clients, I told her, showing her the financial records I'd copied. That's how he's maintaining both households. He's been skimming for years. Diane's professional composure finally cracked entirely. I'm married to a criminal, she whispered. A thief and what's the legal term for having 2 wives? Bigamist, I supplied. Though technically your marriage is the legal one, mine came second. Her face softened with unexpected compassion. That doesn't make your marriage any less real to you, your pain any less valid. Her kindness broke something in me. Tears I'd been holding back for 2 days finally spilled over. I was going to try for a baby this year, I confessed. I thought our marriage problems were my fault, that I wasn't attentive enough, wasn't exciting enough. I've been in therapy trying to be a better wife while he's been living a whole separate life. Diane reached across the table and took my hand. Me too, she admitted. Not the baby part, but the blame, the therapy, the constant effort to fix something that was never broken. Because the real problem was that my husband had another wife. The absurdity of our situation hit us simultaneously, and a strange, broken laughter bubbled up between us. Not humor, there was nothing funny about our shattered lives, but the hysterical release of unbearable tension. What do we do now? Diane asked when our inappropriate laughter subsided. First, we find out where he actually is right now, I said. Then we plan our confrontation, and then we decide whether to turn him in for the financial crimes. Diane's eyes widened. You'd consider not reporting him? I shrugged. Depends on what he has to say for himself, on whether he shows any remorse, on what kind of settlement he offers us both. You're thinking more clearly than I am, she admitted. I'm still trying to process that my entire marriage has been a lie. I wasn't thinking clearly at all, but action, any action, felt better than drowning in the emotions threatening to overwhelm me. We turned to practical matters. Diane called in favors from friends at the airport, trying to trace Robert's actual flight. I contacted the credit card companies we shared, requesting recent transaction records. By evening, we had our answer. Robert Wilson was in Las Vegas, staying at the Bellagio, making charges that suggested he wasn't alone. "A third woman?" Diane asked, her voice strained. "Or just a fling," I replied. "Either way, we know where he'll be on Sunday evening." We made our plans carefully. Diane would be waiting at her home in Brookline, the first place Robert was scheduled to return to after his Phoenix trip. I would be there too, hidden until the right moment. We would confront him together, present our evidence, and demand answers before deciding our next steps. Sunday evening arrived with excruciating slowness. I sat in Diane's guest bedroom, door closed, listening for the sound of a key in the lock. Her house was eerily similar to mine. Similar color scheme, similar furnishings, similar photos of a smiling Robert displayed on the mantel. He'd even bought us both the same anniversary gifts over the years. Identical diamond earrings for our first anniversaries, identical bracelets for our second. The parallel deception was meticulous, precise, and utterly sociopathic in its attention to detail. At 7:43 p.m., I heard the front door open. Robert's voice called out cheerfully, "Honey, I'm home. The Phoenix deal closed early, so I caught an earlier flight." Diane's reply was calm, controlled. "I'm in the living room. How was Phoenix?" "Hot as usual. The clients were demanding, but the contract makes it worth it. I brought you something." I could hear him moving through the house, the sounds of luggage being set down, keys being tossed onto a counter, normal sounds, husband coming home sounds. My cue came minutes later, 3 short knocks on the guest room door from Diane, our agreed signal. I opened the door and walked silently down the hallway, stopping at the entrance to the living room. Robert stood with his back to me, handing Diane a small gift bag, his attention fully on her face. "Robert," Diane said quietly, "there's someone here you should see." He turned, confusion evident on his face before he saw me. The transformation was instantaneous. Shock, fear, then a rapid calculation visible in his eyes as he processed the implications of my presence in his Boston home. "Allison?" He looked between us, already crafting a story, an explanation. How did you two?" "Don't," I said, my voice ice cold. "Don't insult us with more lies. We know everything." "We've compared notes," Diane added, equally frigid. "We've seen the financial records. We know about the embezzlement. We know you were in Las Vegas this weekend, not Phoenix or Boston." Robert's confident facade crumbled. He sank onto the couch, his face ashen. "I can explain," he began weakly. "Can you?" I stepped further into the room. "Can you explain 5 years of systematic deception? Can you explain marrying both of us? Creating 2 separate lives? Stealing from your clients to fund your lies?" "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he said, running his hands through his hair. "I married Diane first. It was real, is real. But then I met you, Allison, and there was a connection I couldn't ignore. I thought I could end things with Diane, make a clean break, but..." "But what?" Diane demanded. "What stopped you from divorcing me before marrying her?" Robert looked between us, desperation growing. "I couldn't hurt you like that, either of you, and then it just continued. Each year made it harder to untangle. I told myself I was protecting you both." "Protecting us?" My voice rose incredulously. "By lying to us daily for years? By stealing to maintain your double life? How exactly was that protection?" "You were both happy," he argued. "Neither of you suspected anything. We had good marriages, good lives." "Based on lies," Diane cut in. "Everything, every anniversary, every holiday, every I love you. It was all a performance, a calculated manipulation." Robert's expression shifted, hardened. The desperate husband disappeared, replaced by something colder, more calculating. "What do you want from me? Money? Revenge? To see me in jail? Because I can tell you right now, if you report the financial irregularities, no one gets anything. The accounts get frozen, both houses go into foreclosure, and we all lose." His rapid pivot to threats and self-preservation told me everything I needed to know about the man I'd married. The man I thought I'd married had never existed at all. "We haven't decided yet," I said coldly. "That depends on what you offer us, on whether you show a shred of genuine remorse." "And on what we find when we dig deeper," Diane added. "Are there others, Robert? A third wife? A fourth? How far does this deception go?" He flinched, confirming our suspicions without words. "Who is she?" I asked. "The woman in Las Vegas?" "No one important," he muttered. "Just a friend." "Like we're just friends?" Diane's voice dripped with contempt. "More lies, even now, when you're caught." Robert's shoulders slumped in defeat. "What do you want me to say? That I'm a terrible person? That I never should have done this? Fine, I admit it. I made a massive mistake that spiraled out of control. But I did care for both of you. That wasn't fake." "Caring doesn't look like this," I said quietly. "Caring doesn't systematically deceive and manipulate people for years. That's not love, Robert, that's control." We spent the next 2 hours alternating between rage and questioning, trying to understand the incomprehensible, how someone could maintain such an elaborate deception for so long, how he could look both of us in the eyes and make promises he never intended to keep. His explanations were hollow, self-serving. He portrayed himself as trapped by circumstance rather than as the architect of his own elaborate fraud. He revealed under pressure that the woman in Vegas was indeed someone he'd been seeing for months. Not a wife, but a girlfriend he'd set up in a condo he paid for. By midnight, my emotional resources were depleted. I'd heard enough excuses, enough justifications, enough evidence that the man I'd married was a stranger to me. "Here's what happens now," I said finally, cutting off another of his self-pitying monologues. "You're going to transfer $50,000 to each of us immediately, a down payment on what you owe us both emotionally and financially. Then you're going to sign divorce papers and disappear from our lives." "And if I don't?" A hint of his earlier calculation returned. "Then we go to the FBI," Diane said firmly. "Wire fraud crosses state lines. The evidence we've gathered shows years of systematic theft. That's federal prison time, Robert." His face paled. "You've already contacted the authorities?" "We've prepared everything," I bluffed, thankful for Diane's quick understanding as she nodded in confirmation. "The documents are with our lawyers, ready to be submitted if we don't check in daily." It was a lie, but an effective one. Robert visibly deflated, defeat written in every line of his body. "Fine," he said hollowly. "I'll transfer the money tonight. I'll sign whatever you want. Just don't turn me in, please." As I watched my husband, our husband, crumble before us, I felt no satisfaction, no vindication, only a profound emptiness where love had once lived, and the disturbing realization that I had spent 5 years of my life loving a man who had never actually existed. The days following our confrontation with Robert passed in a surreal blur. True to his word, perhaps the first honest thing he'd done in years, he transferred the money to both of us before fleeing Diane's house that night. By morning, his cell phone was disconnected. By the end of the week, he'd emptied his office in Denver and disappeared. I returned home to a house that no longer felt like mine, filled with photographs and mementos from a marriage that had been built on lies. Each happy moment captured in those frames was tainted now. Each memory poisoned by the knowledge that while Robert smiled beside me, he'd been maintaining a parallel life with another woman. The practical matters were overwhelming. I hired a divorce attorney who was simultaneously fascinated and appalled by my situation. In 20 years of practice, I've never encountered an actual bigamy case, she admitted during our first meeting. It actually simplifies things legally. Your marriage is automatically void since he was already married. But the financial entanglements will be complex. Complex was an understatement. The house had both our names on the mortgage, as did several investment accounts. Robert's business, what appeared to be his legitimate business, separate from the accounts he'd been embezzling from, was partially in my name for tax purposes. Untangling our lives would take months, possibly years. The emotional aftermath was even more complicated. I vacillated between rage, grief, humiliation, and a strange, detached numbness. Some moments I could almost convince myself it had been a bizarre dream. Others, the betrayal hit with such physical force that I could barely breathe. Most disturbing were the moments of doubt. Had I somehow caused this? Had I been blind to obvious signs? Had I driven him to seek fulfillment elsewhere? Intellectually, I knew these thoughts were irrational. Robert's deception had begun before he even met me. His pathology wasn't my responsibility. But emotions rarely listen to logic. 3 weeks after our confrontation, Diane called. We'd exchanged numbers but hadn't spoken since I'd returned to Denver. "They found him," she said without preamble. "Robert, he's been arrested." My heart lurched. "We didn't report him. Did you change your mind?" "No," she said, her voice tight. "It wasn't us. Apparently one of his clients discovered the missing funds and reported it independently. The FBI raided his office in Boston this morning." The news should have brought satisfaction, but instead I felt only exhaustion. What happens now? "They want to interview both of us," Diane replied. "As potential accomplices initially, then as victims once they understand the situation." "Do they know about us, the marriages?" "They do now. I had to explain why I had access to his financial records, why I knew about the embezzlement." She paused. "They were shocked, Allison. Apparently this isn't common even for them. Our shared husband had managed to distinguish himself even among criminals." The FBI interviews were grueling. I provided all the evidence I'd gathered, explained how I'd discovered the deception, answered endless questions about our finances, our routines, our life together. The agents were professional but couldn't quite hide their morbid fascination with Robert's double life. "We've seen romantic scammers before," one agent told me, "but usually they're after quick money, romance the victim, get access to their accounts, then disappear. Maintaining 2 separate marriages for years? That's another level of commitment to the con." "He was very committed," I replied bitterly, "to everything except the actual marriages." The investigation revealed the full extent of Robert's crimes. He'd embezzled nearly $2 million from various clients over 7 years, using the money to maintain his multiple households and fund a lifestyle that included luxury vacations, expensive gifts, and, we discovered, a gambling habit that explained many of his business trips. More disturbingly, evidence suggested there wasn't just the girlfriend in Vegas. There were other women, other relationships, other lives he'd been cultivating. None had progressed to marriage yet, but several had received promises, rings, discussions of future plans. Each new revelation was another blow, another reminder that everything I'd believed about my life had been carefully scripted fiction. 6 weeks after Robert's arrest, Diane called again. "I'm coming to Denver next week," she said. "I thought maybe we could meet, talk. No one else really understands what this is like." She was right. Friends and family had been supportive, but couldn't truly comprehend the unique horror of discovering your marriage was one of multiple identical performances being enacted simultaneously in different cities. Only Diane knew exactly what I was experiencing. We met at a quiet restaurant halfway between the airport and my house. The initial awkwardness dissolved quickly as we began sharing our experiences of the aftermath, the humiliating explanations to friends and family, the practical nightmares of financial disentanglement, the emotional whiplash of grief and rage. "I keep finding things," Diane confessed over wine. "Little lies I never questioned. The fishing trips with college friends who don't exist. The conference in Chicago that never happened. Each one feels like he's betraying me all over again." I nodded in understanding. "I found a hidden email account last week. 5 years of correspondence with the Vegas woman. He told her the same stories he told us, the demanding clients, the stressful travel, even used the same phrases sometimes." "Like he had a script," Diane said, the pain evident in her eyes. "Exactly. I wonder if he ever knew which lies he was telling to which wife, if he ever mixed us up in his mind." According to his assistant, his real assistant at the legitimate part of his business, he kept meticulous records. Separate phones, separate calendars, separate notes about conversations with each of us so he wouldn't confuse the details. The calculated nature of his deception was almost impressive in its thoroughness. Almost. By our 3rd glass of wine, the conversation had shifted from Robert to ourselves, who we were before him, who we might become after. "The strangest part," I admitted, "is that I'm not sure I knew him at all, but I'm also not sure I knew myself. I became who I thought he wanted, accommodating, unquestioning, supportive without demands. I silenced my own instincts to preserve a marriage that wasn't even real. Diane's eyes widened in recognition. Yes, exactly that. I kept thinking if I was just more understanding about his travel, more independent, less needy, he'd be happier with our marriage. Meanwhile, he was literally living another life and would have continued indefinitely if he hadn't been caught, I said, the familiar anger rising again. At least we caught him before wasting more years, Diane offered, before having children with him. The thought of how much worse this could have been, co-parenting with a man capable of such deception, sent a chill through me. What will you do now? I asked her. After the divorce, after the legal issues are resolved? Diane considered the question seriously. Start over, I suppose. Sell the house, too many tainted memories, focus on my career, learn to trust myself again before I even think about trusting someone else. She looked up at me. You? Similar plans. Though I'm keeping the house for now, the market's bad and it's convenient for my business, but I'm redecorating, removing every trace of him. I sighed deeply. And I fired Dr. Marlowe. Diane laughed unexpectedly. Me too, though technically she fired herself. Something about unprecedented ethical complications. Our shared laughter felt like the first genuine moment of healing I'd experienced since discovering Robert's betrayal. Not because anything was funny, but because in that moment I didn't feel so frighteningly alone in this bizarre experience. As we parted that evening, Diane hugged me, an unexpected gesture that brought tears to my eyes. We're going to be okay, she said firmly. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but eventually. He doesn't get to break us. For the first time since reading those therapy notes, I actually believed that might be true. Robert's trial began 4 months after his arrest. The evidence against him was overwhelming, not just the financial crimes, which were extensively documented, but the bigamy charges added after Diane and I provided our marriage certificates and testimony. I attended the first day of proceedings, sitting at the back of the courtroom, watching the man I'd thought I knew transformed into Defendant Wilson. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the setting and circumstances, his confident charm replaced by a nervous pallor. He saw me as they led him out. Our eyes met briefly across the crowded room. I expected to feel something, rage, vindication, even lingering affection. Instead, I felt nothing but a distant pity for someone so broken that he'd constructed elaborate fictions rather than live authentically. I didn't return for the remaining days of the trial. I'd seen what I needed to see, confirmed what I needed to confirm. The man I'd married had never existed at all. Robert ultimately accepted a plea deal, 15 years for the financial crimes, with the bigamy charges handled separately. The sentencing judge was particularly harsh, noting the extraordinary and calculated deception perpetrated against multiple victims over many years. With the legal proceedings underway, I focused on rebuilding. I sold my house despite the market, unwilling to continue living surrounded by memories of a fraudulent marriage. I used part of the proceeds, along with Robert's down payment and my portion of the restitution ordered by the court, to buy a smaller place closer to downtown. No wedding photos on these walls. No the Wilsons' welcome mat at this door. I found a new therapist, carefully vetted and recommended by friends rather than by a manipulative spouse. Dr. Keating specialized in betrayal trauma, a term I hadn't known existed, but which perfectly described my experience. What you're experiencing is similar to PTSD, she explained during our second session. Your sense of reality was systematically undermined for years. Your trust wasn't just broken, it was exploited by someone who deliberately manufactured a false reality for you to live in. The validation that my disorientation and emotional volatility were normal responses to abnormal circumstances was surprisingly healing. I wasn't overreacting. I wasn't dwelling unnecessarily on the past. I was processing genuine trauma. The most insidious aspect of this kind of betrayal, Dr. Keating continued, is how it makes you question not just your judgment of others, but your understanding of your own life. Events you experienced, emotions you felt, decisions you made, all were based on deliberately false information. How do I trust again? I asked. Not just others, but myself, my own perceptions? By recognizing that skepticism isn't the same as paranoia. By understanding that trusting after betrayal isn't about eliminating doubt, but about managing it appropriately. We worked on practical exercises, identifying when hypervigilance was speaking versus reasonable caution, recognizing reaction patterns stemming from the betrayal, rebuilding confidence in my own judgment through small, verifiable decisions. Diane and I continued to meet occasionally, finding unexpected comfort in the only other person who truly understood our unique experience. We joked darkly about starting a support group for victims of marital fraud, then actually researched whether such a thing existed. It didn't, though perhaps it should. I went on a date last week, she confessed during one of our dinner meetings, 6 months after Robert's conviction. First one since everything. How was it? I asked, genuinely curious about whether romantic recovery was possible after what we'd experienced. Terrifying, she admitted with a self-deprecating laugh. I kept looking for inconsistencies, listening for lies, checked his hand for a tan line where a ring might usually be, asked detailed questions about his job, his family, his living situation. Poor guy, I said, smiling despite myself. Though can you blame us for being thorough now? That's the thing, Diane said thoughtfully. I don't want to become someone who treats every man like a potential Robert, who enters relationships armored in suspicion. That gives him too much power over my future. Her words resonated deeply. In protecting myself from future betrayal, was I allowing Robert's deception to dictate my approach to all relationships? Was my healing being hindered by the very defenses I'd erected to facilitate it? I brought these questions to my next therapy session. Trust after betrayal isn't about returning to blind faith, Dr. Keating reminded me. It's about developing informed faith, trust supported by evidence, reinforced by transparency, sustained by consistent truth-telling. It's not about assuming the best without question, but about allowing for the possibility of good while remaining grounded in reality. 11 months after discovering Robert's double life, I attended a professional conference related to my event planning business. During a networking reception, I met Michael, an architect whose firm specialized in restoring historic venues for modern events. Our conversation was professional, engaging, focused on potential collaboration. When he asked for my business card, I provided it without hesitation. When he followed up with an email the next day suggesting coffee to discuss a specific project, I agreed. I didn't tell him about Robert during that first meeting, nor the second. By the third, when our conversations had expanded beyond professional matters, I found myself at a crossroads: continue getting to know this seemingly kind, intelligent man, or retreat to the safety of my post-betrayal isolation. I need to tell you something, I said finally, midway through our lunch. Something about my past that affects how I approach relationships now. I gave him the abbreviated version: marriage, betrayal, discovery, divorce. Not the full sensational story, but enough to explain my caution, my hesitation, my moments of irrational suspicion. Michael listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful. When I finished, he didn't offer platitudes or dismissals. "Thank you for trusting me with that," he said simply. "It can't have been easy to share, especially with someone you're just getting to know." "It isn't," I admitted, but hiding it felt too much like participating in my own deception. He nodded in understanding. "What would help you feel secure if we continue seeing each other? More transparency, moving more slowly, specific reassurances?" The question caught me off guard. No one had asked me what I needed to feel safe since the betrayal. I'd assumed the burden of managing my trust issues was entirely mine. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I'm still figuring that out." "Then we'll figure it out together," he said, reaching across the table to briefly touch my hand. No rush, no pressure, just honest communication. Something long frozen inside me began to thaw with those words. Not naive trust, I would never again believe blindly, but the possibility that with the right person, authentic connection might still be possible. The healing process wasn't linear. Some days I felt almost normal, engaged with my work, present with friends, open to new experiences. Other days, a random trigger, finding an old email from Robert, hearing our wedding song in a store, seeing a man who resembled him on the street, would plunge me back into the acute pain of discovery. But gradually, the good days outnumbered the bad. The betrayal became a chapter in my story, rather than the defining narrative of my life. I began to recognize that while Robert had taken much from me, years, trust, innocence, he hadn't taken my capacity for joy, for connection, for growth. Perhaps the most healing moment came 14 months after the discovery, when I received an unexpected package. Inside was a book titled The Gift of Fear and a handwritten note. Allison, thought you might find this as helpful as I did. Learning to trust our instincts doesn't mean living in fear. It means honoring the wisdom we've earned through experience. Diane. I sat on my new couch in my new home, holding this gift from the woman who had every reason to see me as a rival, but had instead become an ally in healing, and felt something I hadn't experienced in too long. Genuine hope for the future. Robert had unwittingly connected us, not as victims who would forever be defined by his betrayal, but as survivors who refused to let one man's pathology determine our worth or our capacity for authentic connection. His deception had been elaborate, but our recovery would be even more remarkable. 2 years after the fateful therapy session that revealed my husband's double life, I stood at the podium of a professional conference for therapists and counselors preparing to share my story. Dr. Marlowe sat in the front row, not as my therapist anymore, but as the professional who had invited me to speak after publishing an ethics paper on the inadvertent discovery of her client's connection. We had long since resolved our professional relationship, acknowledging that while her error had been unintentional, it had ultimately been the truth I needed. My name is Allison Weber, formerly Wilson, I began, addressing the room of mental health professionals. 2 years ago, I discovered through an accidental glimpse at therapy notes that my husband of 5 years was simultaneously married to another woman in another city. The room remained respectfully silent, but I could see the shock register on many faces, the same shock I'd felt that day in Dr. Marlowe's office. What followed was the unraveling of an elaborate deception spanning multiple states, multiple relationships, and millions of dollars in financial fraud. But this isn't a story about my ex-husband's crimes. It's about the unique psychological impact of discovering your entire reality has been carefully manufactured by someone you trusted completely. Over the next hour, I shared my journey, the disorientation of discovery, the challenge of separating reality from fiction, the struggle to trust my own perceptions again. The psychological term gaslighting was insufficient to describe the experience of learning that 5 years of daily life had been built on systematic lies. The most damaging aspect wasn't the betrayal itself, I explained. It was the realization that I had been living in a narrative constructed specifically to manipulate me. Every conversation, every anniversary celebration, every fight and reconciliation had been managed by someone with a completely different agenda than what I understood. I described the healing process, the specialized therapy, the gradual rebuilding of trust in myself first, then cautiously in others. The unexpected solidarity with Diane, who had joined me for several sessions of the conference and would be participating in tomorrow's panel discussion. As I concluded my presentation, I shared the framework we'd developed together, a way of understanding profound betrayal not just as personal trauma, but as an opportunity for extraordinary growth. I don't minimize the damage done, I said, or suggest that such betrayal is ever a gift. But I do believe that surviving it requires developing capabilities most people never need to cultivate. Exquisite attunement to intuition, genuine discernment rather than suspicion, the capacity to remain open despite legitimate fear. The response was overwhelming. Mental health professionals lined up afterward, sharing their own clients' stories of deception, asking for resources, thanking me for articulating an experience many of their patients couldn't effectively describe. This wasn't how I'd imagined my life unfolding. I'd never sought to become an expert in betrayal recovery or a speaker at psychological conferences. But the journey had transformed me in ways I couldn't have anticipated. My event planning business had evolved to include consulting for nonprofit organizations supporting women leaving deceptive or abusive relationships. I developed workshops on financial literacy and independence, teaching the warning signs I'd missed and the protective measures I wished I'd known. And perhaps most surprisingly, I'd begun writing a book about the experience, focusing not on Robert's sensational crimes, but on the recovery process, the practical and emotional steps that had taken me from devastated victim to empowered survivor. Diane had contributed several chapters, offering her parallel perspective. Our unlikely friendship had become one of the most valuable outcomes of the entire ordeal, a connection forged in shared trauma, but sustained by mutual respect and genuine caring. My personal life had healed as well, though differently than I'd expected. Michael and I had dated for nearly a year, his patience and transparency helping me rebuild my capacity for trust. We'd eventually recognized we worked better as friends than romantic partners, but the relationship had been crucial in proving to myself that connection was still possible. Now, 2 years out, I was cautiously seeing someone new, a relationship characterized by deliberate transparency, ongoing conversation about boundaries and expectations, and a shared commitment to honesty even when uncomfortable. The hypervigilance had faded gradually. I no longer scrutinized every statement for inconsistencies or investigated simple claims about work meetings or past relationships. The constant internal alarm system had quieted, replaced by a more calibrated awareness, not paranoia, but appropriate caution informed by experience. After my presentation, Diane and I met for dinner at the hotel restaurant. Her transformation had been equally remarkable. She'd been promoted at work, had started her own photography business on the side, and was considering moving to the West Coast for a fresh start. "Did you ever imagine we'd be here?" she asked, gesturing vaguely to encompass not just the conference but the whole of our current lives. "When we were sitting in that cafe 2 years ago, both shell-shocked and devastated, did you see any path to where we are now?" I shook my head. Never. I couldn't see past the next hour, let alone years into the future. "I keep thinking about something my grandmother used to say," Diane mused. "The most beautiful things often grow where the lightning struck. At the time, everything was just burning, but look what's grown from those ashes." We'd received word the previous month that Robert had attempted to appeal his sentence, claiming his financial crimes were motivated by emotional distress rather than greed. The appeal had been denied, the judge noting that his elaborate deception showed clear premeditation and calculation. Neither of us followed his case closely anymore. He occupied less and less space in our thoughts as time passed, becoming a chapter in our histories rather than the defining force in our presence. What remained beyond the trauma and recovery was a profound appreciation for authentic connection, the kind built on genuine sharing rather than performance, on vulnerability rather than manipulation, on truth even when uncomfortable. I'd learned that trust isn't about certainty, it's about the courage to remain open despite knowing the risks. That forgiveness isn't about excusing harm, but about releasing its power to define your future. That healing doesn't mean forgetting or minimizing betrayal, but integrating it into a larger narrative that includes growth and resilience. Most importantly, I'd learned that while my marriage had been a carefully constructed illusion, my recovery was authentically mine. Each painful step, each hard-won insight, each moment of returning strength genuinely earned, and therefore unassailable. As Diane and I finished our dinner, a young woman approached our table tentatively. "Excuse me," she said. "I attended your presentation today. I'm a therapist working with several clients dealing with similar betrayals, and I wanted to thank you both for showing that there's a way through this, that discovery isn't the end of the story." Diane and I exchanged glances, recognizing in the stranger's gratitude a reflection of our own journeys, from devastation to purpose, from victimhood to advocacy, from broken to beautifully rebuilt. "It's not the end," I confirmed gently. "It's a terrible, painful middle. But what comes after, that part is still being written, and you get to hold the pen." If you've connected with this story, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to know they're not alone in experiencing betrayal or struggling to rebuild trust. Your comments about similar experiences or questions about the recovery process are welcome. This community has become an invaluable resource for many walking this difficult path. And if you're in the midst of your own discovery or recovery journey, remember, the person who betrayed you doesn't get to determine your worth or your future. That power has always belonged to you, even when it felt like everything else had been taken. Thank you for listening.